The dark is rising. Day 7, Part 2. And the rain beat down on them harder, and somewhere, distant thunder rumbled in the early night as the huge Shire horse Pollux splashed patiently on through the rising brown river that had once been Huntercombe Lane. It was impossible to tell where they were, a wind rising, and Will could hear the sounds of swaying trees above the steady turning of Pollock's feet. Scarcely a light showed in the village. He supposed that the electric power must still be cut off, either by accident or by agent of the dark. In any case, most of the people of this part of the village were still at the manor. "Where's Merriman?" he called through the loud rain. "At the manor," George shouted in his ear, "with Farmer Bassett." "You mean they're trapped?" Will's voice turned shrill with alarm. Old George said, hissing close, hard to hear, "They hold attention, so we may work, and floods make them busy too. Look down, boy." In the churning water, the light from the signs showed a scatter of unlikely objects bobbing past. A wicker basket, several disintegrating cardboard boxes, a bright red candle, some tangled strands of ribbon. Suddenly Will recognized one piece of ribbon, a lurid purple and yellow check, as a wrapping he had seen Mary carefully pull off a parcel and roll up on Christmas Day. She was a great hoarder, like a squirrel. This had to be into her hoard. "Those things are from our house, George. Flood's there, too," the old man said. "Land's low. No danger, though. Be easy. Just water and mud." Will knew he was right, but again he longed to see for himself. Rushing about they would all be, moving furniture and rugs, clearing books and everything movable. These first floating objects must have escaped before anyone noticed the water was actually carrying things off. Pollock stumbled for the first time, and Will clutched at the wet chestnut mane. For a moment he had almost slipped and been carried off himself. George made soothing noises, and the big horse sighed and snuffled through his nose. Will could see a few dim lights now that must come from the bigger houses on high ground at the end of the village. That meant they must be nearing the common, if it was still the common and not a lake. Something was changing. He blinked. The water seemed further away, harder to see. Then he realized that the light from the signs linked on his wrist was growing dim, fading away to nothing. In a moment they were in darkness. As soon as all the light had died, old George said softly, "Whoa, Polly," and the great Shire horse splashed to a halt and stood there with the water rippling past his legs. George said, "This is where I have to leave you, Will." "Oh," Will said, forlorn. "There is the one instruction," old George said, "that you are to take the white horse to the hunter. That will happen if you fall into no trouble. And there are 2 bits of advice to keep you from trouble. Just from me to you. The first is that you will find enough light to see by if you stand for a count of 100 after I'm gone. The second is to remember what you know already, that moving water is free of magic." He patted Will comfortingly on the shoulder. "Put the signs round your waist again now," he said, "and get down." It was a wet business getting down, worse than getting up. Pollux was so high from the ground that Will splashed into the water like a falling brick. Yet he felt no cold, though the rain beat at him still. It was gentle, and in some curious way it seemed to keep him from being chilled. Old George said again, "I go to gather the hunt." And with no other word of farewell, he set Pollux splashing off again towards the common, and was gone. Will clambered up the snowbank beside the river road, found space to stand without toppling, and began counting up to 100. Before he had reached 70, he began to see what old George had meant. Gradually the dark world was taking on a glimmer of light from within itself. The rushing water, the pitted snow, the gaunt trees, he could see them all, in a gray dead light like dawn. And while he looked round, puzzling, something floating past him on a quick stream brought him such astonishment that he almost fell into the water again. He saw the antlers first, turning lazily from side to side, as if the great head was nodding to itself. Then the colors showed, the bright blues and yellows and reds, just as he had first seen them on Christmas morning. He could not see the details of the strange face, the bird-like eyes, the pricked ears of the wolf, but it was his carnival head, without a doubt, the inexplicable present that the old Jamaican had given Stephen to give him, his most precious possession in the world. Will let out a noise like a sob and leapt forward desperately to seize it before the water carried it out of reach. But he slipped as he jumped, and by the time he had recovered his balance, the bright, grotesque head was bobbing out of sight. Will began to run along the bank. It was a thing of the old ones, and from Stephen, and he had lost it. He must at all costs get it back, but memory caught him in mid-stride, and he paused. "The second thing," old George said, "is to remember that moving water is free of magic." The head was in moving water, only too clearly. So long as it remained there, no one could harm it or use it for the wrong ends. Reluctantly, Will put it out of his mind. The great open common stretched before him, lit by a strange glimmer of its own. Nothing moved. Even the cattle that normally grazed there year-round, looming up out of nowhere on misty days like solid ghosts, were away under cover now, on the farms, driven off by snow. Will moved on, carefully. Then the noise of the water that had been in his ears for so long began to change, growing louder, and before him, the torrent, filling Huntercombe Lane, turned aside, joining a tiny local stream that had swollen now into a foaming river rushing over the common and away. The road that had been the river road wound on, unhindered, solid, and gleaming. Old George, Will sensed, had gone that way. He would have liked to take the road too, but he felt that he was to stay with the river through the extra sense of the old ones. He knew that it would show him how to take the white horse to the hunter. But who was the hunter, and where was the white horse? Will went gingerly forward along the lumpy snowbank edging the new-swollen stream. Willows lined it, squat and pollard. Then suddenly, out of the dark line of the trees on the far side of the stream, a white shape leapt. There was a glimmer of silver in the darkness that was not quite dark, and in a spray of wet snow the great white mare of the light was standing before Will, her breath clouding round the streaks of rain. She was tall as a tree, her mane blown wild by the wind. Will touched her gently. "Will you carry me?" he said in the old speech, "as you did before?" The wind spurted as he spoke, and the bright lightning flashed jagged round the edge of the sky, closer than it had been. The white horse shuddered, her head jerking up. But she relaxed again almost at once, and Will, too, felt instinctively that his brewing thunderstorm was not a storm of the dark. It was expected. It was a part of what was to come. The light was rising, before the dark could rise. He made sure the signs were secure on his belt, and then, as once before, he reached up to wind his fingers in the long, coarse hair of the white mane. Instantly his head spun in giddiness, and the clear, but far off, he heard the same music, bell-like and haunting, the same heart-catching phrase, till with a great jolt the world turned, the music vanished, and he was up on the back of the white mare, high among the willow trees. Lightning was flickering all around the growling sky now. Muscles bunched in the tremendous back beneath Will, and he gripped the long mane as the horse leapt out across the common, out over the hillocks and ravines of snow, its hoofs grazing the surface to leave a wake of icy spray. Through the rush of the wind, he thought, as he clung close to the mare's arched neck, that he could hear a strange, high yelping in the wind, like the sound of migrating geese flying high. The sound seemed to curve around them and then to go on ahead, dying out of range. The white horse leapt high. Will clung tighter as they rose over hedges, roads, walls, all emerging from the melting snow. Then a new noise, louder than the wind of the thunder, was in his ears, and he saw glinting, ruffled black glass ahead of them, and knew that they had come to the Thames. The river was far wider than he had ever seen it here. For more than a week it had been shut tight and narrow by icy walls of overhanging snow. Now it had broken loose, foaming and roaring, with great chunks of snow and ice tossing like icebergs. This was not a river. It was a fury of water. It hissed and howled. It was not reasonable. And as he looked, Will was frightened as he had never been by the Thames. It was as wild as a thing of the dark could be, out of his knowledge or control. Yet he knew it was not of the dark, but beyond either light or dark, one of the ancient things from the beginning of time. The ancient things: fire, water, stone, wood, and then, after the beginning of men, bronze and iron. The river was loose, and would go according to its own will. The river will come to the valley, Merriman had said. The white mare paused irresolute on the edge of the wild, cold water, then surged forward and leapt. It was only as they rose over the churning river that Will saw the island, an island where none had been before in this swollen torrent, divided by strange glinting channels. He thought as the white horse jolted him to earth again among bare, dark trees. It's a hill, really, a piece of high ground cut off by the water. And suddenly he knew very clearly that he would meet great danger here. This was his place of testing, the island that was not an island. Once more he looked up into the sky and silently, desperately called for Merriman, but Merriman did not come, and no word or sign from him came into Will's mind. The storm was not breaking yet, and the wind had dropped a little. The noise of the river was louder than all else. The white mare bent her long neck, and Will scrambled awkwardly down. Through the mounded snow, sometimes ice hard and sometimes soft enough to drop him thigh deep, he set out to explore his strange island. He had thought it a circle, but it was shaped like an egg, its highest point at the end where the white mare stood. Trees grew round the foot. Above them was an open, snowy slope. Above that, a cap of rough scrub dominated by a single gnarled ancient beech tree. Out of the snow at the foot of this great tree, most perplexing, 4 streams ran downhill or down over the hill island, dividing it into 4 quarters. The white horse stood motionless. Thunder rumbled out of the flickering sky. Will climbed to the old beech tree and stood watching the nearest spring foam out from beneath a huge snow-mounded root, and the singing began. It was wordless. It came in the wind. It was a thin, high, cold whine with no definable tune or pattern. It came from a long way off, and it was not pleasant to hear. But it held him transfixed, turning his thoughts away from their proper direction, turning them away from everything except contemplation of whatever happened to be closest at hand. Will felt he was growing roots, like the tree above him. As he listened to the singing, he saw a twig on a low branch of the beech close to his head that seemed, for no reason, so totally enthralling that he could do nothing but gaze at it, as if it contained the whole world. He stared for so long, his eyes moving very gradually along the tiny twig and back again, that he felt as if several months had passed, while the high, strange singing went on and on in the sky from its distant beginnings. And then suddenly it stopped, and he was left standing dazed, with his nose almost touching a very ordinary beech twig. He knew then that the dark had its own way of putting even an old one outside time for a space, if they needed a space for their own magic. For before him, next to the trunk of the great tree, or great beech, stood Hawkin. He was more recognizable Hawkin now, though still Walker in age. Will felt that he was looking at two men in one. Hawkin was dressed still in his green velvet coat. It seemed still fresh, with a touch of white lace at the neck, but the figure within the coat was no longer neat and lithe. It was smaller, bent and shrugged by age, and the face was lined and battered beneath long, wisping gray hair. The centuries that had beaten at Hawkin had left only his sharp, bright eyes unchanged. Those eyes looked at Will now, with cold hostility across the mounded snow. "Your sister is here," Hawkin said. Will could not stop himself from glancing quickly round the island, but it was empty as before. He said coldly, "She is not here. You're not going to catch me with a silly trick like that." The eyes narrowed. "You are arrogant," Hawkin hissed. "You do not see all that is to be known in the world, old one with the gift, and nor do your masters. Your sister Mary is here, in this place, though she is not to be seen by you. This is a meeting for only bargain that my lord the writer will make. Your sister for the signs. You scarcely have much choice. You people are good at risking the lives of others." The bitter old mouth curved up in a sneer. "But I do not think Will Stanton would enjoy watching his sister die." Will said, "I can't see her. I still don't believe she's here." Staring at him, Hawkins said to the empty air, "Master." And at once the high, wordless singing began again, catching Will back into the slow contemplation that was warm and relaxing as the summer sun, but at the same time horrible in its soft clutch of the mind. It changed him. While he was listening, made him forget the tension of fighting for the light, submerged him this time, and watching the way the shadows of the hollows had made patterns on patch of snow near his feet. He stood there, loosed and relaxed, gazing at a point of white ice here, a hollow of darkness there, and the singing whined in his ears like the wind through chinks in a crumbling house. And then again it stopped, and there was nothing, and Will saw with a shock like sudden cold that he was staring not at a pattern of mere shadows on snow, but at the lines and curves of his sister Mary's face. There she lay on the snow, in clothes she had worn when he last saw her, alive and unharmed, but gazing blankly up at him, without any sign that she recognized him or knew where she was. Indeed, Will thought unhappily he did not know where she was either, for although he was being shown the appearance of her, it was most unlikely that she was really there, lying there on the snow. He moved to touch her, and as he expected, she vanished completely away, and only the shadows lay on the snow as before. "You see," said Hawkin, unmoving beside the beech tree, "there are some things that the dark can do, many things over which you and your masters have no control at all." "That's pretty obvious," Will said. "Otherwise, there wouldn't be such a thing as the dark, would there? We could just tell it to go away." Hawkin smiled, unruffled. He said softly, "But it will never go away. Once it comes, it breaks all resistance into nothing, and the dark always comes, my young friend, and always win. As you see, we have your sister. Now you will give me the signs." "Give them to you?" Will said with scorn. "To a worm who crawled to the other side? Never." He saw the fist clenched briefly at the cuffs of the green velvet jacket, but this was an old Hawkin, not to be drawn. He had himself under control now that he was no longer the wandering walker, but part of the dark. There was only a small catch of fury in the voice. You would do well to deal with the messenger of the dark, boy. If you will not, you may call up more than you will wish to see." The sky flickered and rumbled, bringing a brief, bright light from the dark, roaring water all round, the great tree peaking the tiny island, the bowed, green-jacketed figure beside its trunk. Will said, "You are a creature of the dark. You chose betrayal. You are nothing. I will not deal with you." Hawkins' face twisted as he stared venomously at him, then looked towards the dark, empty common and called, "Master!" Then again, an angry shriek this time, "Master!" Will stood tranquil, waiting. On the edge of the island he saw the white mare of the light, almost invisible against the snow, raise her head and sniff the air, snorting softly. She looked once towards Will as if in communication, then wheeled round in the direction from which they had come, and galloped away. Within seconds something came. There was no sound still, but the rushing river and the grumbling, looming storm. The thing that came was utterly silent. It was huge, a column of black mist like a tornado, whirling at enormous speed upright between the land and the sky, and at either end it seemed broad and solid, but the center wavered, grew slender, and then thicker again. It wove to and fro as it came in a kind of macabre dance. It was a hole in the world, this whirling black spectre, a piece of eternal emptiness of the dark made visible. As it came closer and closer to the island, bending and weaving, Will could not help backing away. Every part of him shouted silently in alarm. The black pillar swayed before him, covering the whole island. Its whirling, silent mist did not change, but parted, and standing within it was the Black Rider. He stood with the mist wreathing round his hands and head, and smiled at Will, a cold, mirthless smile, with the heavy bars of eyebrows furrowed and ominous above. He was all in black again, but the clothes were unexpectedly modern. He wore a heavy black donkey jacket and rough, dark denim trousers. Without a flicker in the chill smile, he moved aside a little, and out of the snaking black mist of the column came his horse, the great black beast with fiery eyes, and on its back sat Mary. "Hello, Will," Mary said cheerfully. Will looked at her. "Hello. I suppose you were looking for me," Mary said. "I hope nobody got worried. I only went for a little ride, just for a minute or two. I mean, when I went looking for Max, and then I met Mr. Middleton, and found Dad and had sent him to look for me, well, obviously it was all right. I had a lovely ride. It's a super horse, and such a lovely day now." The thunder rumbled behind the massing gray-black cloud. Will shifted unhappily. The rider, watching him, said loudly, "Here's some sugar for the horse, Mary. I think he deserves it, don't you?" And he held out his hand, empty. "Oh, thank you," Mary said eagerly. She leaned forward over the horse's neck and took the imaginary sugar from the rider's hand. Then she reached down beside the stallion's mouth, and the animal licked briefly at her palm. Mary beamed. "There," she said. "Is that good?" The Black Rider still gazed at Will, his smile widening a little. He opened his palm in mockery of Mary, and lying in it, Will saw a small white box made of a nicely transparent glass, with lines of runic symbols engraved on the lid. "Here, I have her, old one," said the rider, his nasal accented voice softly triumphant, "caught by the marks of the old spell of lure that was written long ago on a certain ring and then lost. You should have looked more closely at your mother's ring, you and that simple craftsman, your father, and Lion, your careless master. Careless. Under that spell I have your sister bound by totem magic, and yourself bound too, powerless to rescue her. See?" He flicked the little box open, and Will saw lying in it a round, delicately carved piece of wood, wound with a fragile gold thread. With dismay, he remembered the only ornament that had been missing from the Christmas collection carved by Father Dawson for the Stanton family, and the golden hair that Mr. Middleton, his father's visitor, had with casual courtesy flicked away from Mary's sleeve. "A birth sign and a hair of the head are excellent totems," the writer said. "In the old days, when we were all less sophisticated, you could, of course, work the magic even through the ground a man's foot had trod, or where his shadow had passed," Will said. "But the dark casts no shadow," the writer said softly. "And an old one has no birth sign," said Will. He saw uncertainty flicker over the intent white face. The writer shut the white box and slipped it into his pocket. "Nonsense," he said curtly. Will looked at him thoughtfully. He said, "The masters of the light do nothing without a reason, writer, even though the reason may not be known for years and years. 11 years ago, Farmer Dawson of the Light carved a certain sign for me at my birth, and if he had made the sign with the letter of my name, as the tradition was, then perhaps you could have used it to trap me into your power. But he made it in the sign of the light, a circle cut by a cross, and as you know well, the dark can use nothing of that shape for its own purpose. It is forbidden. He looked up at Ryder. He said, "I think you are trying to bluff me again, Mr. Middleton. Mr. Middleton, Black Rider of the Black Horse." The rider scowled. "Yet still you are powerless," he said, "for I have your sister, and you cannot save her except by giving me the signs." Malignance glittered again in his eyes. "Your great and noble book may have told you that I can not harm those who are of the same blood as an old one. But look at her. She will do nothing that I suggest she should do. Even jump into the swollen... Anything I suggest you should do, even jumping into the swollen Thames. There are parts of the craft that you people neglect, you know. It is so simple to persuade folk into situations where they bring accidents upon themselves, like your mother, for instance. So clumsy." He smiled again at Will. Will stared back, hating him. Then he looked at Mary's happy, sleeping, waking face, and ached that she should be in such a place. He thought, and all because she's my sister, all because of me. But a silent voice said into his mind, "Not because of you, because of the light, because of all that must always happen to keep the dark from rising." And with a surge of joy, Will knew that he was no longer alone, that because the rider was abroad, Merriman was near by again too, free to give help if need be. The rider put out his hand. "This is the time for your bargain, Will Stanton. Give me the signs." Will took the deepest breath of his life and let it out slowly. He said no. Astonishment was an emotion that the Black Rider had forgotten long ago. The piercing blue eyes stared at Will in total disbelief. "But you know what I shall do." "Yes," Will said, "I know, but I will not give you the signs." For a long moment the rider looked at him, out of the vast black pillar of swirling mist in which he stood. In his face incredulity and rage were mingled with a kind of evil respect. Then he swung round to the black horse and to Mary and called aloud some words in a language that Will guessed from the chill they put into his bones must be the spell speech of the dark, seldom used aloud. The great horse tossed his head, white teeth flashing, and bounded forward with happy witless. Mary clutching his mane and gurgling with laughter. He came to the overhanging snowbank that bordered the river and paused. Will clenched the signs on his belt, agonized by the risk he was taking, and with all his might summoned the power of the light to come to his aid. The black horse gave a shrill, shrieking whinny, and leapt high into the air over the Thames. Halfway through his leap, he twisted strangely, bucking in the air, and Mary screamed in terror, grabbing wildly at his neck. But her balance was gone, and she fell. Will thought he would faint as she turned through the air, his risk bursting into disaster, but instead of splashing into the river, she fell into the soft, wet snow at its brink. The black rider cursed savagely, lunging forward. He never reached her. Before he was in mid-stride, a great arrow of light came from the storm amass now almost overhead, and a gigantic crack of thunder, and out of the flash and the roar a blazing white streak rushed over the island towards Mary, catching her up so that in an instant she was gone, seized away, safe. Will hardly managed to get a glimpse of Merriman's lean form, cloaked and hooded, on the white mare of the light, with Mary's blonde hair flying where he held her. Then the storm broke, and the whole world flaming round his head. The earth rocked. He saw for an instant Windsor Castle outlined black against a white sky. Lightning seared his eyes. Thunder beat at his head. Then through the singing in his dazed ears he heard a strange creaking and crackling close by. He swung round. Behind him the great beech tree was cleft down the middle, blazing with great flames, and he realized with amazement that the eager current of the island's 4 streams was growing less and less, dwindling down to nothing. He looked up fearfully for the black column of the dark, but it was nowhere to be seen in the raging storm, and the strangeness of all else that was happening drove the thought of it out of Will's head. For it was not only the tree that had been split and broken. The island itself was changing, breaking open, sinking towards the river. Will stared speechless, standing now on the edge of snow-mounded land, left by the vanished streams, while around him snow and land slid and crumpled into the roaring Thames. Above him he saw the strangest thing of all. Something was emerging out of the island as the land and snow fell away. There came first, from what had been the taller end of the island, the roughly shaped head of a stag, antlers held high. It was golden, glinting even in that dim light. More came into sight. Will could see the whole stag now, a beautiful golden image, prancing. Then came a curious carved pedestal on which it stood, as if to leap away. Then behind this a long, long horizontal shape, as long as the island, rising again at the other end to another high, gold glinting point, tipped this time by a kind of scroll, and suddenly realized that he was looking at a ship. The pedestal was a high curving prow, and the stag its figurehead. Astonished, he moved towards it, and imperceptibly the river moved after him until there was nothing left of the island but the long ship on a last circle of land, with a last rearing snowdrift all around it. Will stood staring. He had never seen such a ship. The long timbers of which it was built overlapped one another like the boards of a fence, heavy and broad. They looked like oak. He could see no mast. Instead, there were places for row upon row of oarsmen. Up and down the whole length of the vessel in the center was a kind of deck house that made the ship look almost like Noah's Ark. It was not a closed structure. Its sides seemed to have been cut away, leaving the corner beams and roof like a canopy. And inside, beneath the canopy, a king lay. Will drew back a little at the sight of him. The mailed figure lay very still, with sword and shield at side, and treasure piled round him in glittering mounds. He wore no crown. Instead, a great engraved helmet covered the head and most of the face, crested by a heavy silver image of a long-snouted animal that Will thought must be a wild boar. But even without a crown, this was clearly the body of a king. No lesser man could have merited the silver dashes and jeweled purses, the great shield of bronze and iron, the ornate scabbard, the gold-rimmed drinking horns, and the heaps of ornaments. On an impulse, Will knelt down in the snow and bowed his head in respect. As he looked up again, rising, he saw over the gunwale of the ship something he had not noticed before. The king was holding something in his hands, where they lay tranquilly folded on his breast. It was another ornament, small and glittering, and as Will saw it more closely, he stood still as stone, gripping the high oaken edge of the ship. The ornament in the quiet hands of the long-ship king was shaped as a circle, corded by a cross. It was wrought of iridescent glass, engraved with serpents and eels and fishes and waves and clouds and things of the sea. It called silently to Will. It was without any question the sign of water, the last of the 6 great signs. Will scrambled over the side of the great ship and approached the king. He had to take care where his feet moved, or he would have crushed the fine work of engraved leather and woven robes and the jewelry of enamels and closet and filigree gold. He stood looking down for a moment at the white face half hidden by the ornate helmet, and then he reached reverently across to take the sign. But first he had to touch the hand of the dead king, and it was colder than any stone. Will flinched and drew back, hesitating. Merriman's voice said softly from close by, "Do not fear him." Will swallowed. "But he's dead. He has lain here in this burial ground for 1,500 years waiting. On any other night of the year he would not be here at all. He would be dust. Yes, Will, this appearance of him is dead. The rest of him has gone out beyond time, long since. But it's wrong to take tribute away from the dead. It is the sign. If it had not been the sign and destined for you, the sign seeker, he would not be here to give it to you. Take it." So Will leaned across the briar and took the sign of water from the loose grip of the dead cold hands, and from somewhere off a murmur of his music whispered in his ears and then was gone. He turned to the side of the ship. There beside him it was Merriman, sitting on the white mare. He was cloaked in dark blue, with his wild white hair uncovered. The hollows of his bony face were dark with strain, but the light gleamed in his eyes. "It was well done, Will," he said. Will was gazing at the sign in his hands. The sheen over it was the iridescence of all mother of pearl, all rainbows. The light danced on its as it danced on water. "It's beautiful," he said. Rather reluctantly he loosened the end of the belt and slipped the sign of water on, to lie next to the glimmering sign of fire. "It is one of the oldest," Merriman said, "and the most powerful. Now that you have it, they lose their power over Mary forever. That spell is dead. Come, we must go." Concern sharpened his voice. He had seen Will grasp hastily at a beam as the long ship suddenly unexpectedly lurched to one side. It rose upright, swayed a little, then tipped in the opposite direction. Will saw, scrambling for the side, that the flames had risen still further while he was not watching. Water lapped around the great ship, and it was almost afloat. Not for long now would the dead king rest on the land that had once been an island. The mare wheeled towards him, snuffling a greeting, and in the same enchanted, music-haunted moment as before, Will was up on the white horse of the light, sitting in front of Merriman. The ship tilted and swung, fully afloat now, and the white horse wheeled out of its way to stand nearby, watching the river water foaming around its sturdy legs. Creaking and rattling, the long ship gave itself to the rush of the swollen Thames. It was too large a vessel to be overwhelmed. Its weight kept it steady, even on that swirling water, once it had found balance. So the mysterious dead king lay in dignity still, among his weapons and gleaming tribute, and Will had a last glimpse of the mask-like white face as the great ship moved away downstream. He said over his shoulder, Who was he?" There was grave respect on Merriman's face as he watched the long-lost ship go. "An English king of the Dark Ages. I think we will not use his name. The Dark Ages were rightly named. A shadowy time for the world, when the Black Riders rode unhindered over all our land. Only the old ones, and a few noble brave men, like this one, kept the light alive. And he was buried in a ship like the Vikings." Will was watching the light glimmer on the golden stag of the prow. "He was part Viking himself," Merriman said. "There were 3 great ship burials near this Thames of yours in days past. One was dug up in the last century near Taplow and destroyed in the process. One was this ship of the light, and not destined ever to be found by men. And one was the greatest ship of the greatest king of all, and this they have not found and perhaps never will. It lies in peace." He stopped abruptly, and at a movement of his hand the white horse turned, ready to leap away from the river to the south. But Will was still straining to watch the long ship, and something of his tension seemed to infect both horse and master. They paused. In that moment, an extraordinary streak of blue light came hurtling out of the sea, not from the thundering sky, but from somewhere across the common. It struck the ship. A great silent rush of flame burst there, over the broad river and its craggy white banks, and from prow to stern the king's ship was outlined by leaping fire. Will gave a choking, wordless cry, and the white horse stirred uneasily, pawing at the snow. Behind Will, Merriman's strong, deep voice said, "They vent their spite because they know they are too late. Very easy it is, now and again, to predict what the dark will do." Will said, "But the king, and all his beautiful things." If the writer paused for thought, he would have known that his outburst of malice has done no more than create a right and proper ending for this great ship. When his king's father died, he was laid in a ship in the same way, with all the most splendid possessions round him, but the ship was not buried. That was not the way. The king's men set fire to it and sent it off burning alone over the sea, a tremendous sailing pyre. And that, look, is what our king of the last sign is doing now, sailing in fire and water to his long rest, down the greatest river of England, toward the sea. And good rest to him, Will said softly, turning his eyes at last from the leaping flames. Before a long time afterwards, wherever they went, they could see the glow from the blazing long ship whitening a part of the storm-dark sky.